Hey, stop scrolling for a second. A billionaire's fiancée mocked a maid in front of 300 wedding guests. She laughed at her uniform. She laughed at her hands. She told her she didn't belong in that ballroom. Then the maid did one thing. One quiet, bold gesture. And the entire room went silent. Nobody in that mansion. Not the groom, not the guests, not even the woman wearing the diamonds, knew who that maid really was. By the end of tonight's story, you won't believe it either. Welcome back, everyone. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and which country do you call home? I love seeing all of you from around the world join these stories. Tonight I'm telling you one of the most emotional, most talked about stories I've ever shared on this channel. It's a story about pride, about a promise made decades ago and almost forgotten, and about one young woman who was underestimated by everyone in that room, except the one person whose opinion mattered most. I won't tell you how it ends. I won't tell you the twist. All I'll say is this. By the time we reach the final section, you may need a tissue nearby. Let's begin. The chandelier lights flickered like they were holding their breath. Charleston, South Carolina. Late September. The kind of warm evening where the air smells like jasmine and old money. The Whitmore estate sat on 11 acres of manicured lawn overlooking the harbor, its white columns glowing under strings of golden light. Tonight, it hosted the engagement gala of Nathaniel Whitmore, heir to one of the oldest shipping fortunes in the South, and Victoria Sterling, a woman whose name appeared in society pages more often than most people's names appeared on birthday cards. Inside the grand ballroom, 300 guests moved like a slow, glittering tide. Champagne flutes clinked. A string quartet played something soft and expensive sounding. Everyone wore black tie. Everyone smiled the practiced smile of people who had learned young that appearances were currency. In the kitchen behind the ballroom, a 26-year-old woman named Amara Johnson tied her apron for the third time that night. Her fingers steady despite the chaos around her. She had been hired 2 weeks earlier through a catering agency, one of a dozen staff brought in for the event. Long shifts, aching feet. A paycheck that would cover this month's rent and maybe next month's too if she was careful. Amara didn't come from money. She'd grown up in a small house outside Savannah with her grandmother, Ruth, a retired nurse who raised her after Amara's parents passed when she was young. Ruth had worked 2 jobs most of her life and still found time to teach Amara to read before kindergarten, to sew a hem, to hold her chin up no matter who looked down on her. "Baby," Ruth used to say, "people will judge you by your uniform. Never let them make you believe it." Amara carried those words like armor. Tonight, she carried a silver tray instead, weaving through the crowd with practiced grace, refilling glasses, offering hors d'oeuvres, smiling politely at people who barely looked at her twice. She was used to being invisible in rooms like this. It didn't sting anymore. Mostly. Across the ballroom, Victoria Sterling stood at the center of attention. Her sapphire blue gown catching the chandelier light, a diamond necklace resting against her collarbone like it had been born there. She laughed at exactly the right moments, touched Nathaniel's arm in exactly the right way, performed the role of blushing bride-to-be with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it her whole life. Nathaniel stood beside her, tall, composed, the kind of handsome that photographed well. But if you watched closely, and almost nobody did, you'd notice something in his eyes. Distance. A quiet weariness that didn't match a man about to marry the woman everyone told him he was lucky to have. He hadn't proposed because he was swept away by love. He'd proposed because his father had built an empire out of Whitmore shipping, and empires needed heirs, and heirs needed the right kind of wife, one who understood galas and boardrooms and how to smile for cameras. Victoria understood all of it perfectly. What Nathaniel didn't know yet was that somewhere in this very ballroom stood a woman he used to know. A woman whose name he hadn't spoken aloud in nearly 15 years. Amara moved past the head table, tray balanced, eyes forward. She didn't recognize the groom yet. The room was too crowded, the lighting too golden, too many faces blurring into one wealthy, indistinct crowd. But there was one person in that ballroom who recognized her. Seated near the back in a wheelchair polished as carefully as the silverware, was Eleanor Whitmore, Nathaniel's 91-year-old grandmother, the woman who had built this family's fortune from nothing after her husband died young, the matriarch everyone respected and few truly knew. Eleanor's sharp blue eyes followed Amara across the room. Her breath caught somewhere deep in her chest. Around her neck, hidden beneath her collar, Amara wore a small gold locket. It had been her grandmother Ruth's. Amara didn't know its history. She only knew Ruth had given it to her the day she left for Charleston, pressed it into her palm and said, "This kept me alive once. Now it'll remind you where you come from." Eleanor Whitmore had seen that exact locket only once before in her life. 68 years ago. The night a hospital fire nearly took everything from her. She reached for her cane, steadying herself, unable to look away. Something was about to happen tonight that no one in that ballroom, not Victoria in her sapphire gown, not Nathaniel with his practiced smile, not even Amara herself, could possibly see coming. But first, the room would have to get much, much worse before it got better. Somebody was about to say something they could never take back. The evening moved forward the way galas always do. Toasts, laughter, the soft clatter of forks against fine china. Amara continued working the floor, careful and quiet, refilling glasses near a group of Victoria's closest friends, women in gowns that cost more than Amara's annual rent. She didn't mean to overhear. She never did. But conversation carries in rooms built for acoustics, and Victoria's voice, bright, performative, made for an audience, carried further than most. "Honestly," Victoria was saying to her friends, swirling her champagne, "I don't know how Nathaniel's family finds these girls. They hire anyone off the street these days." Her friends laughed, the polite, complicit laugh of people who knew better than to disagree. Amara kept her eyes down, kept moving, kept her face neutral. She'd heard worse. She told herself it wasn't about her specifically. She told herself a lot of things to get through nights like this. But then Victoria's eyes landed on her. "You," Victoria said, snapping her fingers lightly, the way one might call a waiter or a dog. "My glass is empty." Amara turned, tray steady, and refilled it without a word. "Careful," Victoria added, loud enough for the small circle around her to hear, glancing at Amara's hands. "Those nails. Did they let you serve food looking like that?" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter passed through the group. Amara's hands, steady, capable hands that had bathed her dying grandmother in her final months, that had scrubbed dishes and folded linens and held a Bible at a small funeral 3 years ago, were in fact perfectly clean. Just unpolished. Just real. "I apologize if that's a concern, ma'am," Amara said quietly, her voice even. "I'll be more careful." She turned to leave. Victoria wasn't finished. "Wait." Victoria's tone shifted, sharper now, aimed to land in front of the growing audience nearby. "What's your name?" "Amara. Amara." Victoria repeated it like it was something faintly amusing. "You know, Amara, women like you should really be grateful for opportunities like this. A night in a house like this. Most people in your position never even get to see a place this beautiful, let alone stand in it." The words hit the air and hung there. A few guests exchanged glances. Somewhere near the back, Eleanor Whitmore's grip tightened on the arms of her wheelchair. Amara felt heat rise in her chest, not embarrassment but something steadier. Something her grandmother had planted in her years ago and never let die. "With respect, ma'am," Amara said, meeting Victoria's eyes for the first time all night, "I don't need permission to appreciate something beautiful. I just need to be treated like a person while I do my job. The circle around them went quiet. Victoria's smile thinned into something colder. Excuse me, she said, voice rising just enough to turn heads 2 tables away. Did you just... Victoria. Nathaniel's voice cut in, low and firm, as he stepped up beside her, sensing the tension before he even understood its shape. What's going on? Nothing, Victoria said quickly, recomposing her smile like flipping a switch. The help was just being a little sensitive. Nathaniel looked at Amara, really looked for the first time that night. Something flickered behind his eyes, a half-formed recognition he couldn't yet place, like hearing a song from childhood before remembering its name. I'm sorry, he said to Amara, quiet enough that only she and Victoria could hear. That wasn't necessary. Victoria's jaw tightened. She wasn't used to being contradicted, especially not in front of an audience, and especially not on behalf of a maid. Nathaniel, she said, forcing a laugh. It's really not a big deal. It is, he said simply. For a moment, something passed between Nathaniel and Amara. Not romantic, not dramatic, just human. A flicker of familiarity neither could name yet. Then across the ballroom, a wheelchair began moving. Eleanor Whitmore, 91 years old, was pushing herself forward with more strength than anyone had seen from her in years. Her eyes fixed on the gold chain barely visible at Amara's collar. That locket, Eleanor said, her voice trembling as she reached the small crowd. Child, where did you get that locket? The entire circle turned. Victoria's confident smile faltered for the first time all evening. Amara's hand rose instinctively to her collarbone, fingers brushing the small gold shape beneath her uniform. It was my grandmother's, she said softly. Ruth Johnson. Why? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears so suddenly, so completely, that for a moment she couldn't speak at all. Ruth, she finally whispered. Ruth Johnson saved my life. And just like that, 68 years of silence began to break open. The ballroom fell so quiet you could hear the chandelier crystals settling. Grandmother. Nathaniel crouched beside Eleanor's wheelchair, alarmed by the tears streaming freely down her face. What's wrong? What are you talking about? Eleanor didn't answer him right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on Amara, on the small gold locket, on the young woman's face as though she were looking straight through time. May I? Eleanor asked, reaching a trembling hand toward the necklace. Amara, bewildered but gentle, unclasped it and placed it carefully in the older woman's palm. Eleanor opened the tiny locket with fingers that shook, not from age but from something far deeper. Inside, a faded black and white photograph. A young nurse in a starched uniform, standing outside a hospital that no longer existed, smiling at whoever held the camera. That's her, Eleanor breathed. That's Ruth. The crowd around them had grown, curious guests drifting closer, drawn by the strange electricity in the air. Victoria stood frozen at the edge of it, her earlier cruelty suddenly very small and very public. I was 23 years old, Eleanor began, her voice steadying as the memory took hold of her fully. It was 1958. I just married into this family, and my husband, Nathaniel's grandfather, was overseas on business when there was a fire at St. Agnes Hospital, where I was recovering after losing our first child. A hush fell deeper across the room. Even the string quartet had quietly stopped playing. The smoke came so fast, Eleanor continued. Nurses were pulling patients out, but there were too many of us and not enough hands. I was too weak to walk. I remember thinking I was going to die in that bed, alone, 3 floors up, with flames already in the hallway. Her voice caught. Nathaniel reached for her hand. A young nurse came back in for me, Eleanor said. Everyone else had already evacuated the floor. She wasn't even assigned to my room. But she came back. She carried me down 3 flights of stairs on her own back, through smoke so thick I couldn't see her face, and she didn't stop until we were both outside. Eleanor looked up, eyes glistening, locket clutched to her chest. Her name was Ruth Johnson. I never got the chance to properly thank her. My husband moved us to Charleston within the month. My family cut ties with the hospital's board after a scandal that had nothing to do with her. And in all the chaos, I lost her address. I spent years trying to find her. I even hired someone once, decades ago, to search. But Ruth had married, changed her name, moved to Savannah. The trail went cold. Eleanor turned to Amara, tears now falling freely. I made a promise to myself that night, she said, that if I ever found that young nurse or her family, I would spend the rest of my life making sure they never wanted for anything. I never got the chance. She looked around the ballroom, at Nathaniel, at the stunned guests, at Victoria standing pale near the edge of the crowd. Until tonight. Amara stood frozen, overwhelmed, the pieces of her grandmother's quiet, humble life rearranging themselves in her mind. Ruth had never once mentioned a fire. Never mentioned saving anyone. She'd simply lived, modestly, kindly, without ever asking for recognition. She never told me any of this, Amara whispered. She was always the one taking care of people. She never talked about herself. That, Eleanor said, gripping Amara's hand now with surprising strength, sounds exactly like the woman who saved my life. Nathaniel stood slowly, staring at Amara with new eyes. And then, all at once, the recognition he'd been chasing all evening clicked fully into place. Amara, he said slowly. Amara Johnson. From Riverside Elementary. Amara blinked, startled. Nathaniel Whitmore. 15 years earlier, before boarding school pulled him into a different world, before his father's business demanded he become someone else entirely, an 11-year-old Nathaniel had spent one unforgettable summer at his grandmother's old lake house near Savannah, technically outside the family's usual circles, enrolled briefly in public school while his parents dealt with a difficult year. He'd been the awkward rich kid nobody understood. Amara had been the girl who shared her lunch with him every day for 3 months because he never seemed to have any, too proud to admit his parents had forgotten to send money to the school. They'd been inseparable that summer. And then, without warning, he'd been pulled back into private school, into a different life, and they'd lost touch completely. I can't believe it's you, Nathaniel said, something unguarded breaking through his composed exterior for the first time all night. You saved my... He stopped himself, glancing at Victoria, then back at Amara. You were the only real friend I had that summer. The ballroom, 300 strong, stood in stunned silence. And standing at the very edge of that silence, Victoria Sterling realized, with rising cold panic, that everyone in that room had just watched her humiliate the granddaughter of the woman who saved Eleanor Whitmore's life, and the childhood friend the groom hadn't stopped thinking about in 15 years. Her carefully built world was about to come apart in front of everyone she'd ever tried to impress. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The whole room waited for what would happen next. Victoria forced a laugh, brittle and thin, into the silence. This is quite the coincidence, she said, reaching for Nathaniel's arm, trying to pull the room's attention back toward herself. Small world, right? Darling, we should let the staff get back to. Victoria. Nathaniel's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight it hadn't held all evening. Stop. She blinked at him. Excuse me. You insulted her. He said it plainly, not raising his voice, but every word landing like a stone dropped into still water. In front of everyone. You called her hands dirty. You told her she didn't deserve to be in this house. I was just. You were cruel, Eleanor said from her wheelchair, her tone suddenly steel beneath the tears. To the granddaughter of the woman who saved my life. In my home. At my grandson's engagement. Victoria's face flushed, torn between defending herself and recognizing, perhaps for the first time, how thoroughly the room had turned against her. I didn't know who she was, Victoria said, quieter now, almost pleading. That's exactly the problem, Nathaniel said. You shouldn't have needed to know who she was to treat her like a human being. The words landed heavier than anyone expected. Heaviest of all on Nathaniel himself. Because in that single sentence, he understood something about the last 2 years of his life that he'd been avoiding. He thought about every gala, every dinner, every quiet cruelty he'd watched Victoria deliver to waiters, to assistants, to anyone she deemed beneath her, and how he'd let it slide each time, telling himself it wasn't his business, telling himself that was simply how people like her had been raised. He thought about how different it felt standing next to Amara for these last 10 minutes than it had felt standing next to Victoria for the last 2 years. I think, Nathaniel said slowly, we need to talk. Not here. Not tonight in front of everyone. He glanced at the crowd, at the phones some guests had quietly begun raising. But we need to talk. Victoria's composure cracked fully now, her eyes darting around the ballroom, searching for an exit that wouldn't feel like a defeat. Nathaniel, you cannot be serious. You're going to throw away everything for a maid? Because your grandmother had some fever dream about a hospital fire 60 years ago. The word maid hit the air like a slap. Somewhere in the crowd, a guest audibly gasped. That maid, Eleanor said, voice rising with a strength that silenced the entire room, carried a debt in her blood that this family has failed to repay for nearly 70 years. That maid's grandmother walked back into a burning building to save a stranger, expecting nothing in return. And you, she looked at Victoria with an expression of quiet, devastating clarity, couldn't manage basic kindness to a woman refilling your champagne glass. Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time all evening, she had nothing to say. Amara stood at the center of it all, overwhelmed, her tray long forgotten on a nearby table, Ruth's locket still resting in Eleanor's trembling palm. I don't want any trouble, Amara said quietly, her voice cutting gently through the tension. I didn't come here for this. I came here to work a shift and go home. I know, Eleanor said, taking Amara's hand and placing the locket back into it with both palms, closing her fingers around it like sealing a promise. And that, child, is exactly why you deserve what's coming. Amara frowned, confused. What do you mean? Eleanor looked up at her grandson, then at the room full of guests, then finally back at the young woman standing before her in a rented uniform, unaware that her whole life was about to change. I mean, Eleanor said, that a promise made 68 years ago is finally going to be kept. And somewhere behind them, Victoria Sterling quietly began to realize that the life she'd built her entire identity around was slipping through her fingers, in front of everyone who mattered. What happened over the following weeks would change more than one life. News travels fast in small, wealthy circles. Faster still when it involves a scene at the Whitmore estate captured on a dozen phones and shared long before the caterers had finished cleaning up. By the next morning, whispers moved through Charleston society like wildfire. The Sterling engagement was off. Victoria left the gala that night in her car alone. Her sapphire gown suddenly looking less like a triumph and more like a costume for a role she could no longer play. Nathaniel didn't chase after her. He didn't need to. Something had shifted permanently in him the moment he watched Amara respond to cruelty with dignity instead of anger. A quiet strength that made him realize how much he had been settling for in his own life. 2 days later, Eleanor Whitmore summoned Amara to the estate, not as a member of catering staff but as an invited guest. Amara almost didn't go. She sat on the edge of her small apartment bed that morning, turning the invitation over in her hands, half convinced this was some elaborate misunderstanding that would embarrass everyone once it unraveled. Ruth had raised her to be humble, not to expect windfalls, not to believe fairy tales showed up in real life. But her grandmother had also taught her something else, Don't let fear close a door that kindness opened. She went. Eleanor received her in a sunroom overlooking the harbor, tea already poured, an old cedar box resting on the table between them. I want to tell you the rest of the story, Eleanor said. The part one didn't get to finish at the party. She explained that after the fire, she had spent decades quietly trying to trace the young nurse who saved her. Writing letters, hiring investigators, even placing a newspaper ad in the 1970s that never received a response, because by then Ruth had remarried, moved states away, and started an entirely new chapter of her life focused on raising a granddaughter who needed her more than the past did. I never stopped looking, Eleanor said. Not really. I set aside something years ago, not out of guilt but out of gratitude, for whoever I might one day find. I want you to have it. She opened the cedar box. Inside sat a folded document, the deed to a modest but comfortable property near Savannah, fully paid, along with a trust fund Eleanor had quietly maintained for decades, adjusted for inflation, waiting for an owner who never came, until now. Amara stared at it, stunned, hands trembling. Mrs. Whitmore, I can't accept this. You don't owe me anything. My grandmother didn't save you for a reward. I know, Eleanor said gently. That's exactly why she deserves one. Kindness given without expectation is the only kind worth honoring properly. Amara wept quietly at the table, thinking of Ruth. Years of double shifts, second-hand furniture, a woman who had given everything to a granddaughter and never once complained about what she herself had given up. She wished, more than anything, that Ruth were alive to see this moment, to know that her quiet courage from nearly 70 years ago had finally found its way home. There's something else, Eleanor said, folding her hands. Nathaniel asked me not to influence you either way. But I think you should know, since that night, he's asked about you every single day. Over the following weeks, something quiet and unforced began to grow. Nathaniel visited Amara not as an heir seeking a photo opportunity, but as the 11-year-old boy who remembered exactly what it felt like to be given something. A shared lunch, a moment of unconditional kindness, with absolutely nothing expected in return. He cancelled the family's usual gala circuit for that season. He began spending time at the Savannah Community Center where Amara volunteered on weekends, quietly, without press, learning what it actually meant to give rather than simply inherit. Victoria, for her part, left Charleston within the month. The engagement's collapse became a cautionary tale whispered at every society dinner that fall. Not because she'd lost a billionaire, people said, but because she'd revealed exactly who she was in front of the one person whose respect actually mattered. But the story wasn't finished yet, because one more truth was waiting to come to light. The final piece of the story would bring the whole town to tears. 6 months later, the Whitmore estate hosted another gathering. Smaller this time, warmer, without the performative glitter of the engagement gala. String lights instead of chandeliers. A backyard instead of a ballroom. Real laughter instead of rehearsed smiles. It was a dedication ceremony. With Eleanor's blessing and full support, Nathaniel and Amara had spent the past months turning the old lake house near Savannah, the very place where they'd met as children, into something neither of them expected to build together, a community center and scholarship fund named simply Ruth's House. It offered free tutoring, nursing scholarships for young women from low-income families, and a small clinic staffed by volunteer nurses who, in Ruth's memory, believed that kindness should never require a reason. Standing at the podium that evening, Amara looked out at a crowd entirely different from the one that had watched her get humiliated 6 months earlier. Nurses, teachers, neighbors, old friends from Savannah who remembered Ruth fondly, many with stories Amara had never heard. Small kindnesses her grandmother had quietly performed for decades without ever mentioning them at home. My grandmother never wanted recognition, Amara said, voice steady despite the emotion behind it. She used to tell me that the truest kindness is the kind nobody sees. For almost 70 years, One act of courage she never spoke about quietly waited to come full circle. I think that says something important, that the good we do doesn't disappear even when we forget about it ourselves. Wait. And eventually, it finds its way home. Eleanor, seated in the front row, dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, Nathaniel's hand resting gently on her shoulder. Later that evening, as the crowd began to thin and the string lights flickered against a deep purple sky, Nathaniel found Amara near the water's edge, exactly where they used to sit as children, sharing lunch under a tree that still stood, now twice as tall. "You know," he said, "I used to think the most important thing my family ever built was the shipping company. Turns out the most important thing was 3 months of peanut butter sandwiches from an 11-year-old girl who didn't have much herself, but gave it anyway." Amara laughed softly, wiping her eyes. "I didn't do anything special. I just didn't want you to be hungry." "That," Nathaniel said, "is the special part. You never needed a reason." He didn't propose that night. It wasn't that kind of story. Not yet, anyway. But something steadier, something more honest than any engagement gala had ever held, settled quietly between them as the stars came out over the water. And somewhere, in a way words can't quite capture, it felt like Ruth was there too. No longer invisible, no longer unseen, her quiet courage finally, fully coming home. Here's what this story really teaches us. Kindness is never wasted, even when no one is watching. Even when decades pass. Even when the person you helped never gets the chance to say thank you. What we give freely, without expecting anything back, has a way of finding its way home. Sometimes generations later, in ways we could never predict. And the way we treat people who can't do anything for us. That says more about who we are than anything money can buy. If this story moved you tonight, if it made you believe, even a little, that goodness still finds its way back to those who give it, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. And if you want more stories like this one, real, emotional, human stories that remind us what actually matters, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Share this with someone who needs a little hope today. Someone who's been underestimated. Someone who's still waiting for their own quiet act of kindness to come full circle. Thank you for watching until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.